Bona tarda a totes i a tots. Moltíssimes gràcies per la vostra assistència. Una tarda del mes de maig que s'acaba el curs i sembla que s'acabi el món. Moltíssimes gràcies per el vostre interès per venir en aquesta sessió d'ISDUB. Per les persones que no ho conegueu, ISDUB és una iniciativa que el nom correspon a les seves sigles, debats internacionals de sociologia, que es du a terme per iniciativa dels grups de recerca consolidats vinculats a l'àrea de sociologia. Són aquests diferents grups que assumeixen el fet de convidar a alguna persona, algun professor, alguna persona que fa recerca d'alguna altra universitat del món. I en aquest sentit són els mateixos grups de recerca qui assumeixen, diguem-ne, aquesta iniciativa i, per què no, aquest cost. Avui la iniciativa ha estat, en aquest cas, liderada per dos grups de recerca consolidats de la facultat, dos grups de recerca que són interdisciplinars i que són transversals. El CRIT, que és el grup de creativitat, innovació i transformació urbana, que té membres a diversos departaments, a economia, a teoria sociològica, filosofia de les ciències socials, teoria sociològica, un nom molt llarg, o a sociologia de les organitzacions, i el grup que ens diem territori, població i ciutadania. La iniciativa conjunta ha estat el fet de convidar el professor Ronald van Kempen de la Universitat d'Utrecht i farà una conferència que ara li passarem la paraula a la professora Montserrat Pareja, que presentarà el currículum i el perfil del professor van Kempen i introduirà aquesta conferència que pronunciarà d'aquí una estona.
Moltes gràcies a tothom de nou per venir, perquè coincideixo amb la Cristina que és un dia complicat. Gràcies per ser-hi, gràcies per estar, gràcies per participar amb nosaltres d'aquest esdeveniment acadèmic. A veure, que coneixem el professor van Kempen fa molts anys, i ara I'm saying that we know you for a long time. Continuaré en català perquè si no serà complicadíssim. Ell és catedràtic del Departament de Geografia Urbana a la Facultat de Geociències, al Departament de Geografia Humana i Planejament Espaial de la Universitat d'Utrecht. El professor van Kempen és professor, és catedràtic de Geografia Urbana i la seva recerca es concentra en el que seria la segregació espaial urbana, la diversitat urbana, l'habitatge per grups de renda baixa, la governança urbana i els seus efectes en els barris i en els residents. També ell ha treballat en temes d'exclusió social i també ha treballat amb grups amb minories ètniques en els barris. Ell ha coordinat diferents programes finançats per la Unió Europea i actualment és l'investigador principal d'un projecte que es diu Diverse Cities, bàsicament en resum és governant la diversitat urbana, i aquest projecte encara està ara mateix funcionant. De fet, és un projecte de 2 anys i encara hi ha 2 anys perquè funcioni. En principi, l'objectiu d'aquest projecte, que d'alguna forma estarà representat en la xerrada d'avui, és examinar com les ciutats europees poden beneficiar-se de la diversitat. Tot i així, ha estat dinant, m'ha dit, bueno, però jo ja estic pensant d'aquí 2 anys com podem pensar un repte pel propi projecte. De fet, ell es qüestiona en la presentació d'avui alguna de les hipòtesis de partida d'aquest projecte de Diversities que encara està per acabar. Llavors és una mica pensant en el futur. En Ronald van Kempen ha coeditat llibres, ha coeditat també monogràfics en revistes molt conegudes, internacionals, i ha publicat sobretot en articles i en revistes de geografia urbana i en temes socials. No vull ocupar més temps. Moltes gràcies de nou per ser aquí. Li donarem la paraula al Ronald van Kempen. 45 minutes. I will say hello 5 minutes before ending. So thank you very much.
Thank you for introducing me. I hope you said some nice words. I didn't understand anything from it, but so maybe when I start, I will double with some things Montserrat just said. But I would like to start with thanking you for inviting me to be here in this magnificent room. It's great to be here. It's always great also to be back in Barcelona. Been here several times for business, but also for pleasure. I never attended a football match, but I would like to do that, and especially my 15-year-old son would like to do that. He's constantly saying, when are we going to Barcelona to see a football match? Unfortunately, I have to say we went to Real Madrid a year ago, but well, we will come back. Okay, let's. I will explain first something about this first slide. First, Utrecht University. Utrecht University is the biggest university of the Netherlands, together with the University of Amsterdam. Utrecht is a quite small city in the middle of the country with about 350,000 inhabitants. And because it's quite a large university, the population of Utrecht has a lot of students. So it's a very lively city, a very attractive city, an old city also. And well, I like to live there, I like to work there. And we also have a lot of international programs. We in fact have a lot of students from Spain who are on Erasmus programs and things like that. And we try to be as international as possible. All our master programs are in English, for example. So that helps to attract a lot of international students. Diversities is a project I'm leading for 2 years now, and we still have 2 years to go with this project. I intended to give some results about this diversities project, but I decided to do something else and to build a little bit on what we found in diversities. Diversities is, as you probably heard, a project which tries to find out the positive things about diversity in different cities, exactly 14 cities, 13 European cities and in Toronto. It's financed by the EU, and we're very happy with that. We're working with about 55 researchers on this project. And a European is always built up with a lot of work packages, with a lot of deadlines and a lot of products we have to deliver. And by the end, I will show you the website of this project. So if you're interested in urban diversity, you can find a lot about that on our website. When dealing with urban diversity in the last few years, you discover a lot. And you also discover a lot of things that are missing. And I thought it would be nice in this lecture to try to find out the links, the possible links between urban diversity and inequality. And what I basically will do with you is to try to find out where these missing links are and how we can solve them. If we talk about inequality, I think you all know that Thomas Piketty wrote a big volume about inequality. It's called Capital in the 21st Century. It's a French economist. It was first published in French, but later it was translated in English. And well, at least in our country, in the Netherlands, it became extremely popular. In big piles, it was in the bookshops, and it was sold magnificently. I don't know if people also read it, because you can buy it, but you don't have to read it, of course. But it is a very big book, and it's a very interesting book, and it sparked the discussion, I think, in the Western world again about inequality. And inequality has always existed, of course, and it still exists. And because of this publication, it is on the research agenda again. If you talk about inequality, if people write about inequality, you always see almost on the first page or in the first chapter quotes like this. This is a quote, and there might be hundreds of quotes like this. What is it when you talk about inequality? It is that some people have more than others. That's quite simple. And well, here is it formulated in a world perspective. You can do that in a national perspective, in an urban perspective. But the basic thing about inequality is that some people have more than others, and that this gap between, let's say, rich and poor is increasingly growing. Well, obviously, this has a lot of links to poverty, which is, you could say, the negative side of inequality. So you have very rich people, you have very poor people. I will tell you a little bit more about that later. But obviously the negative side of inequality is poverty. And well, this is another quote. It's about 2030 by Ash Amin. Well, you see a quote, 9 billion humans could be suffering from multiple deprivation, not only low incomes, but also other kinds of problems. So I think we can all agree that we have a problem here. If you talk about inequality, that could be a problem. But if you talk about especially the negative side of inequality, there obviously is a problem because people are probably not extremely happy with their lives. There is another discourse going on, and this is about urban diversity. As I told you, my project is about urban diversity. And when you look especially at the sociological and urban geographical literature, urban diversity is gaining importance. You see more and more articles and books about urban diversity. Of course, not everything is based on our own project. There are a lot of other researchers who do research on urban diversity. And basically, we talk about diversity when you see a lot of people, different people living together somewhere. City, in a neighborhood, and more specifically, it's about socioeconomic, ethnic and cultural diversity. Well, there's a lot of literature. I will tell you more about that. This is only my short introduction. So we have a discourse on inequality on the one hand, principally fed by economists, I think. And we have another discourse on urban diversity, which is more sociological and geographical discourse. What I would like to do in these 3/4 of an hour is to answer these three questions, or to say something about these aims. I want to show you that there is a big gap between the literature on inequality and the literature on urban diversity. And I will especially say something about the critique I have on the current discourse on urban diversity. It's even my own discourse I'm more or less criticizing. And I want to find out if there is a way to connect the different bodies of literature. In a way, this is a search process for myself too. It's the first time I present this. I have read a lot of books and articles, and this is well, this is not finished yet. This whole idea is just a starting point for me to present it to you, and probably later, within 1 or 2 years, I will write a lot of things about this. But well, I want to test this a little bit with you. So this is a long list of what I want to do, but it will go very quickly. Sometimes I will talk about the definition of inequality. I will say something about the bad sides of inequalities. the backgrounds of inequality. Then I will turn to the diversity discourse, tell you something about the urban diversity, and then I will try to make the links and to find the possible gaps between those bodies of literature. As an urban geographer, it is quite natural to see that all cities are in fact unequal. I think if you know something about cities, you should agree with that. There are no equal cities. I mean, cities are always divided. You see numerous different neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, sometimes ghettos, slums. You see enclaves for the rich. You see all kinds of neighborhoods that are specifically housing a lot of groups. And in addition to that, you have a lot of neighborhoods that are quite mixed. Mixed in the sense of, let's say, ethnic characteristics, income characteristics, education, and lifestyles. So imagine your own city where you live. You could immediately detect those differences within a city. So there's nothing new with that cities are unequal, and at the same time they are diverse. If you talk about diversity and inequality, there's also a lot of literature on the topic of urban spatial segregation. Segregation is, well, let's say simply the idea that some people live in some place and some other people live in another place based on ethnicity, based on income or whatever. Segregation also exists everywhere. There is no city without spatial segregation. If that is really bad, that is another question. Some people think, well, yes, segregation is bad. Some other people say, well, that still has to be proved. That is not the topic of my presentation at the moment, but it is interesting, of course, to find out for yourself, especially as an urban geographer or economist or sociologist, to find out why segregation could be bad and how this works in the lives of people. But I will come back to that a little later. Well, as I said, there is a big literature on things that have to do with diversity, with segregation, but also with inequality. But basically there are different research agendas, and they don't overlap. But let me first define some things, because it's always nice to know what I'm talking about, I think. And if you don't define your issues, you might think, well, what is he talking about? So I have quite a few very simple definitions. First, inequality. I use always a very quite old definition by a geographer, by the way, Chris Hamnett. And he said, well, inequality is quite simple. That is the process that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So it's a process, it's not a situation. Related to this term is social polarization. So while inequality, you talk about rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer, it's about amounts of money. Social polarization is more about numbers of people, numbers of households. When you talk about social polarization, it's also based on Chris Hamnett's definition. You talk about increasing number of lower income households and increasing numbers of higher income households, while the middle part, the middle class, is disappearing. So it's a little bit a different discourse than inequality, where you talk about amounts. Rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. Social polarization is more about more people with higher incomes and more people with lower incomes. Why is inequality bad? A lot of articles have been written about this, but there has been a now famous book, I think, by Wilkinson and Pickett, written in 2010. And They make very clear in graphs that there are big relations between inequality on the one hand and all kinds of social and socio-economic aspects on the other hand. I listed a few things here. Unequal societies have higher mortality rates. They have more mental illness. There is more stress. There's lower trust in unequal societies. And Wilkerson and Pickett talk about countries. They compare countries with each other, and they compare American states with each other. So they don't go down to the city level, let alone the neighborhood level. There's more racism, more drug use, and they have about 20 variables with which they indicate that unequal societies have more negative things, like they are listed here. It's a very nice book, very readable book, I must say. So then you can see that, yes, it is a problem, because if you have inequality and it's so much related to all these negative things, well, it's not only about income that is the problem, but it's pervading in all aspects of life, so to say. Why is inequality bad? Also because of the lower side of inequality, because when you have a lot of people with low income, they have a lot of fewer opportunities. For example, they have to rely on the cheap housing stock. They cannot buy expensive dwellings. They cannot rent expensive dwellings. So they are more or less relegated to the most cheap part of the housing stock, which is in most cases related to neighborhoods that are, for example, not so very safe or not so very attractive in various respects. So it's not good to be poor, so to say. So there is this association between, on the one hand, lower incomes, and the other hand, the opportunities people have. That's why inequality researchers research inequality, I think, because there are negative effects. But if you talk about the backgrounds of inequality, and especially about the backgrounds of urban inequality, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of also, well, let's say more or less old research, and then I don't refer to Karl Marx and people like that, because in fact they also already talked about inequality. But if you go back to the 1990s, beginning of the 1990s, you see a lot of people, a lot of researchers who wrote books that are still popular about inequality and the relation, especially with the changing economies. Global economic restructuring can be seen as a very important cause of inequality in the Western world. You all know that, probably. In the 1990s, around the 1990s, a little bit before, a little bit later, a lot of industrial production moved from the western part of Europe to other parts of the world, especially to Eastern Europe, but also and mainly later to China and other Asian countries. So this meant a lot of changes in the economies in the Western world, and it led to a lot of redundancies, a lot of unemployment, especially for those working in factories. And this was related, of course, to another restructuring thing, which was the change from an industrial to a service economy. So on the one hand, you saw that in that period, industrial production disappeared. There was a new service economy, and I think the most important thing about these two literatures is that the redundant persons from the industries could not be employed by the service sector because other capabilities were necessary. So this led to a changing economy. It led to changing opportunities for a lot of people, and well, that you can see that everywhere in every Western country, and in some countries a little bit more than in others. And in a way, this is still going on at the moment, although you see signs of other developments that production is gradually coming back to Western Europe, especially to the United States also, because they found out that if you produce your products in China, there are also some problems with that in terms of transportation costs and things like that. But still, we are, let's say, suffering from what happened in the beginning of the 1990s. And on top of that, of course, you see a lot of negative developments in terms of unemployment as a consequence of the global financial and economic crisis in the past, let's say, 7 years. Well, what is a problem with this is that whatever happens in terms of global restructuring or economic restructuring is that it always affects the poor negatively. The poor always suffer. Even if it is going better in a country, you see that the poor won't profit too much from that. So they're always on the lower side, and they're always suffering. And related to that is the idea of segregation again, that if you live in let's say bad neighborhoods, however, in whatever way you can define that, when the economy is getting better, it does not mean automatically that living in a bad neighborhood is becoming more nice, more nicely. It can still be problematic because there are no investments in that area. So here, I cannot say much about this because of time, but there is the whole discourse on the so-called dual city, that in one part of the city you have the poor people, and in another part of the city you have the rich people, and there are, of course, in a lot of mixed neighborhoods. But when things are happening in the economy, it usually the rich side of the city profits from that, and the poor side of the city does not. Although there's a lot of discourse on the reality of the dual city, but that's another discourse. So far, for the moment, about inequality. And now I will tell you something about diversity. As I said in the beginning, cities are inherently unequal, and cities are also inherently diverse. We all know that cities are diverse because a lot of different people live in cities. And what you see in the last, well, it depends a little bit on the country, last decade or last 2 decades, and sometimes even only the last few years, for example, in Eastern European countries, you see that international migration is a very important cause of an increasing diversity of cities. Immigration from all parts of the world, can be from other parts of Europe, can be from Asia, from Africa, depends also a little bit on the country. It depends also on all kinds of political developments elsewhere in the world. Syria is in war. You see suddenly a lot of immigrants from Syria. If there are economic problems in let's say, Poland, you suddenly see a lot of immigrants from Poland. Maybe not here, but in London, for example, you now have, since 6 years, hundreds of thousands of people from Poland who are looking for a job there. There is an important and expanding discourse on diversity. And in 2006 and in 2007, Steven Vertovec wrote 2 articles about what he called super diversity. Not only diversity, but super diversity. This term super diversity has become immensely popular. There are even institutes of super diversity in Britain and in Germany, for example. And books are written called Super Diversity in all kinds of languages, even in Dutch. And the idea of super diversity is that you should not only look at let's say the diversity between immigrants, but immigrants in themselves are divided. You can have poor immigrants, rich immigrants. You have people who are still connected to their home places and people who are unconnected to the places where they were born. So there's a lot of internal differentiation. And the idea with this discourse about superdiversity is that if you want to do if you want to make a good policy, you should take care of that. You cannot make a policy, for example, for the Turks or the Moroccans or the Syrians because they are so internally divided. I think this is an interesting discourse and a good discourse also, because we have to see that you cannot easily categorize people. You, as researchers, know that, of course, that you cannot easily categorize people, but some people still do. We do have a policy, for example, in the Netherlands that is very much aimed at different immigrant groups. Different policies for different groups, which is, I would say, a little bit old-fashioned. So, immigrants are, let's say, divided among themselves. Superdiversity talks about immigrants. This is interesting because we also know that a lot of people are not immigrants. And for those people who are not immigrants, there's the same, I think. They are also internally divided. So we thought positively about the term superdiversity, and we thought, well, there's more than that. There's even more diversity than superdiversity. You should not only look at demographic and socioeconomic variables, but if you really look at people around you, how are they divided? Not on the basis of color alone, or race, or ethnicity, or income, but maybe especially with respect to lifestyles and attitudes, activities. There is where people differ. That is the important thing, that people can be divided. You can have, let's say it exaggerately, black people and white people. And they might look different, but in their lifestyles and attitudes and activities, they might be exactly the same. And the other way around, if you are belonging to a certain group, certain ethnic group or a certain income group, you might be totally different from each other because the one person does a lot of activities at home and the other person does a lot of activities elsewhere in the city. And the one may be very racist and the other is not, belonging to the same category. So we thought we should add something to this idea of superdiversity. First, that was the name, of course, superdiversity. What is more than super? And we thought, hyper. So we now talk about, in our publications, in our European project, about hyperdiversity. Hyperdiversity takes account of the different lifestyles, the different attitudes and activities people have. And to have this perspective, that makes it possible for us to abandon the traditional divisions between people, but to find out how important these three aspects, lifestyles, attitudes, and activities are, and how they determine the lives of people. Well, this is what I said already. Now, so that was a little bit about the discourse on diversity. And now I'm going to make some links between the two. And I start with a quite old quote by Bob Beauregard and Anne Hyla. It was written in an article, in an edited volume. And they said, urban actors are not simply puppets dancing to the tune of socio-economic and political logics, but rather relatively autonomous agents. I think this is a very interesting quote. Because here is the first thing where it becomes a little problematic to talk about effects of inequality. Because you can talk about inequality, but you also have to talk about the agency of people. People can change things. And people, when Beauregard and Heila talk about urban actors, they mainly refer to the important decision makers, like mayors. Maybe that will change in Barcelona too, quite soon here. Mayors are important, but also private developers are important. And they see things happening in the world. There are global developments, but they can take their own course. That's very important, they say. People can choose. People can choose what to do. It's not an automatic translation from inequality to what is happening in a city. And that is one of the two important missing links I would like to identify, that if you read the literature on inequality, and even also on urban inequality, you see all kinds of global narratives. Things are happening somewhere higher up there, and you see all kinds of correlations between, for example, inequality and mental illness. But how it really works is not clear, and it is especially not clear how people deal with that in their daily lives. So you can say inequality is bad, but is it really bad? How do people deal with it in their daily situations? How do they adapt their lifestyles to them, to that situation of inequality or to the situation of poverty? And when you read these global narratives, these big books about inequality, there's no answer to that. Because these economists, they do not talk about people. They do not talk about actors. They do not talk about people living in cities and living in neighborhoods and how they deal with the global narrative of inequality and poverty. So I would like to see that some people make this connection, and I think that's very important. So from the side of the inequality literature, I miss the link with what is happening, let's say, on the ground, in the city, with the people, in the neighborhoods. But now I turn the perspective around. I will talk from the perspective of diversity. If you look at the literature on diversity, a crucial question might be formulated as, how do urban residents, so not the mayors, not the private developers, but the residents in cities, in neighborhoods, deal with diversity and inequality? I think that's a crucial question. And what you see in a lot of the diversity literature is so many positive things. And I just present you some quotes. As you see from this quote from a Dutch political scientist, contact with, openness to, it's inclusive, all these terms are so positive. And there's a German researcher, and as she writes marvelous articles, but she did her research in the city of Düsseldorf in Germany among Turks in a almost completely Turkish neighborhood. And her conclusion is that Turks feel so comfortable and safe among other Turks, and tea houses are so important to be there, especially for the Turkish man. There's no negative thing about poverty. There's no negative thing about inequality. It's an article, good article, with the conclusion, everything is fine. Another researcher, a German researcher now in England, she uses in her articles and in her books also terms like this: conviviality, civility, commonplace diversity. Commonplace diversity is about how normal diversity is in the lives of people, or even unpanicked multiculturalism. So you can talk about panicked multiculturalism, which is dangerous because different groups have to live together. But she says, well, there's also a lot of unpanicked multiculturalism. People just live together. It's okay. It's fine. So again, it's a lot of positive things here. And then from our own research, these things are not yet published. But we are working on a number of reports now, trying to find out how people live in deprived neighborhoods, how they deal with diversity. And you can also see in those reports quotes like this: well, why is it so nice to live in a diverse area? Well, you can meet in a short distance Indian, Chinese, African, Latino communities. I think that can only be a positive factor, someone said in a neighborhood in Milan. And in a neighborhood in Budapest, it's the same. We can find the same quotes everywhere. In Rotterdam, where we do our own research, in London, in Toronto. It's as if their diversity is only positive. So nice to have those diverse people around you. And increasingly, I start to have some problems with this, because I think this is a missing link. There are a lot of people researching diversity as if it is only positive, with no attention to questions of inequality, no attention for problems that might emerge when living in a deprived area. Only positive. So we are missing something, and we are missing something too with our own project, maybe, you could say. That if you really want to do good research about people living in deprived and diverse neighborhoods, you should have more attention for the negative sides too. So this is my problem with the literature. So on the one hand, I had the first missing link, that those people who do their research on a, let's say, a global level, on a national level, they don't pay attention to what is happening on the ground in neighborhoods. And the diversity researchers, they do a lot of research and find out that it's quite positive that they live in diverse areas, and they don't link to the big questions of inequality and poverty. So I think there's a task for us as social researchers to combine these two issues. So I formulated some research questions that might be interesting for the future. Maybe for myself, as I said, it's a searching process for me, maybe also for you. And I formulated these questions with the idea in mind that you should combine these discourses on diversity and inequality. And then you come to questions like this. For example, the first one: which groups are able to profit from the diversity in the neighborhood and which are not? Here is the inequality issue part of the question, because I think I would like to find out which groups profit and which groups do not profit, and why. What is the process that people do not profit from diversity? Maybe they are afraid of other people. Maybe they don't see the use of contacting others. Maybe they are discriminated because people don't want to talk to you because you have a certain appearance, a certain color, or you don't talk the local language very well. So there are all kinds of possible mechanisms of exclusion that might be very important in the daily lives of people. So that's the second question: which people are excluded, which people are maybe deliberately excluded from parts of social life in the neighborhood. you are not allowed to be part of this association because you are an immigrant. Still happens. But there's not much research anymore, as far as I know. Maybe you do these types of research, but then I would like to know. I pick another one. How do people cope with income differences in their residential area and beyond? You see, especially in mixed urban areas, income differences between the poor and the not so poor, or between the poor and the middle incomes, or even the rich, especially when urban areas are gentrified, parts of urban areas are gentrified, or deliberately urban restructured. They are restructured by the municipality, for example, or by private companies. And you see a kind of mix within neighborhoods between poor and not so poor people. What is the effect of this? We have done a lot of research already about social contacts between those two groups, between the gentrifiers and the poor, and the general conclusion is almost always they don't mix. They have separate lives, they have parallel lives. But we don't know very much about their feelings, especially on the feelings of the people who are on the poor side of the neighborhood. Do they miss it? Do they hate it? Do they hate those invaders? We don't know yet. There are some indications in our own research that indeed the poor people in the deprived urban areas don't like the gentrifiers very much because they have different lifestyles. They talk differently, they have different habits, they drink wine instead of beer and things like that. This is not a kind of people. But the next question is this worse? Is this bad? Should we bother? Well, maybe not, but we can find out if we should bother or not, if it is important to do research in these areas. Final question here, which groups of people are devoid of social contacts because they don't have the money to go out? We find indications of that in our research, in our European project. That why do people don't have social contacts outside of their neighborhoods? Just because they have no money to go somewhere else. So they sit in their streets, especially in southern European countries, because of course the climate is much nicer than in northern European countries. So they sit in their streets and mingle with their neighbors who are the same. Is it bad or is it not bad? How is that in terms of bonding and bridging social contacts? We don't know much about that. And I think it is still important to find out how negative or how detrimental this is. So all these questions are formulated in a way that you are looking for groups of people or maybe individual people who really suffer from things, who are excluded. So it's more a kind of social exclusion agenda than a diversity agenda. And in the exclusion agenda, you combine diversity and inequality. And I think it is very important that when we formulate follow-up proposals for the EU, but also in national contexts, this link should be made much more clearly. So I almost said all this already. Try to be aware of the missing links between the both bodies of literature, the inequality literature and the diversity literature. And you should try to make these links. And then the obvious question is, of course, how to do that. I mean, you can ask Thomas Piketty to write another big volume that takes account of people living in neighborhoods. But probably he says, well, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about people living in neighborhoods. So maybe it's up to us as more urban geographers or sociologists to take up this agenda. And maybe there's an idea of combining, much more combining in multidisciplinary work to with economists, with sociologists, with geographers, maybe political scientists, to find out how we can make interesting agendas that take account of both bodies of literature. I want to end with 2 slides. This is the final slide, and there will be another final slide, so this is not the final slide. Recently I read an article by Aishamin, and he talked about the telescopic urbanism. I thought, well, what is this? And he said, be aware of looking at cities only as something positive. So it's related to what I said about the diversity literature. Be aware of looking at diversity only in a positive way. And he goes one level up, I think, and says, be aware of looking at cities only as growth machines, as places to be for the creative classes. He says the people who do that, they are telescopic. They only see one thing and they forget about what he calls the poor majority city. Now, I don't know if the majority of the city is poor. I don't think so. That's a little bit exaggerated, but I feel his warning. I mean, if you do your research as a responsible social scientist, I think you should always be aware of how the poor live and what the problems they have as a consequence of inequality. So it's a little bit like this. I just found this on the internet. If you are very up in your skies, your rich, your high skyscrapers, do you see any income inequality? And they look at each other, and those scientists, well, they're not scientists, but I see them as scientists, and see, do you see inequality? No, I don't see it, but it's on the ground somewhere. And if you don't see it from your top perspective, you really miss some things. So, thanks for your attention. Yes, it works.
Thank you for your interesting exposition. Ara seria el moment d'iniciar un torn obert de paraules, un debat. Si algú de vosaltres té una qüestió, seria el moment de fer-la.
Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting what you explained. I was wondering, right now with your last slide, with the last slide, I was wondering, how do you include the voices of those who are down there with all the inequalities that we don't see from the top? How do you make it real in your project? Maybe you could explain some more on this.
Yeah, thank you. In our project, we interview people in, let's say, the most deprived areas in 13 European cities and in Toronto. We have open interviews with people living in those areas on the basis of a structured form. So we don't tick boxes, but we have some questions we would like to have answered by those people. We don't only interview the poor people in the deprived areas, but also other people with higher incomes, gentrifiers, for example, and we try to find out what they do, if they make use of the neighborhood, how important the neighborhood is for them, and especially we also ask how important diversity is for them. Well, actually, I cannot say that we ask how important is diversity for you, because that would be a kind of targeted question. So we have open questions. How important is the neighborhood for you? And we try to find out if people say something about diversity. So we don't force them to say anything about diversity, but we try to find out if diversity is in one way or another important. For example, in terms of social contexts. And if they say, well, social contacts are very important for me in this neighborhood, and I mingle with everybody. We ask, everybody? Which kind of people? And then sometimes they say, well, basically they're of my own group. They're also from Turkey, or they're also from Morocco, or they are also 25 years old, like I am. Well, not I am, but the respondent is. And sometimes they say, well, yes, well, as I showed in this quote, people say, well, yes, I like the diversity in my area, and I do profit from it because I learn a lot from all those people around me. So what we do is an open questionnaire without asking them maybe the most important question, where do you suffer? Do you miss something in this area? So also we talk about positive aspects of diversity, which is the aim of this project, by the way. But as I said, it would be nice to have a questionnaire that's more aiming at finding out what the real problems of these people are. I hope that answers a little bit what you want. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for the very stimulating talk. Since the call from the framework program was about managing diversity, I wonder to what extent your project also has to do or is aiming at actually giving some advice on planning diversity. And if that's the case, I wonder whether you contemplate to actually turn around your variables, because you put inequality, which of course we know that is generally negative, mostly negative, especially extreme inequality, and then diversity, which is, let's say, controversial. You put it as a issue there. And I wonder whether you actually take into account approaches that will say, well, look, if we really want to do some planning that turns or the aims at more justice or more better societies, urban societies, we really have to combine equity, which is the opposite, therefore do something about inequality, and keep diversity, because it's not clear whether we are, curious about how much diversity is conflictual or an issue, is better than non-diversity. And of course, it will be, in the case of Susan Feinstein, as you know, there will be a third variable, which is democracy. So once you combine the three, then you may organize some governing or some planning that tends to overcome the situation. And I wonder how much you have discussed or you are, thinking on those lines.
Yeah. I will say a few words about that. The subtitle of our project, Diversities, is Governing Urban Diversity. And this governing aspect is very important. In fact, we have done in the first 1.5 year of our project, we made an inventory of all the policies in our cities, but also of the bottom-up initiatives within those neighborhoods that deal in a way with diversity and with related things like social cohesion, social mobility, and what we call the economic performance of businesses. So we did already an inventory of what is happening in those cities, and we still have to write a so-called, which is maybe typically European, a so-called handbook on how to deal with diversity from a policy or governance perspective. So we will do that. And at the moment, we are interviewing the residents of those neighborhoods. And later, from August, we will interview entrepreneurs in those areas. So in fact, we have 3 groups. We have the policymakers, we have the residents, and we have the entrepreneurs. And the first part relates to your question, I think. Yes, we have done our research. Yes, we will give some, hopefully, new perspectives on how to deal with diversity, but it still has to be written. But I can tell you more about this, but we have an enormous set of reports. We have written 14 times 2 reports, 28 reports about this. And they can be found on our website. But we have to make a summary.
Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to ask you, what kind of connection do you see between the diversity, as you have defined it, and the intersectional approach? I mean, until which extent do you think that this can help to solve those gaps or missing links, for example, combining the ethnic dimension and age or others? Thanks.
We let's say, invented the term hyperdiversity. I showed you, and I think that this should be the way to go forward. That is, to my opinion, it's broader than intersectionality. And I think if this whole idea of looking at lifestyles and attitudes, and especially also at activities of people, is a totally new approach. So new that even we don't know yet how to deal exactly with this. But we constantly have in mind that if you look at people and focus on not on their basic variables like income, race, ethnicity, education, but try to focus on what they really do and what they are interested in to do, it might open up new perspectives. And that's why I think that this term of hyperdiversity might work. But we still have to find out how, because it's extremely difficult, of course. For example, with respect to available data, there are no available data of how people spend their lives during the day for a number of years. You can find data about incomes, you can find data about education, but comparable figures between countries about what people do and how they differ, that's more difficult to find. That's a problem with this approach, I think. But I do think it might be interesting to find out what is possible.
First off, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting, at least for me. And one question, when you refer about diversity, you talk about international immigration in developed countries, in development countries. So in Mexico, for example, the diversity is about people from the same country, for example, Mexico City. So when we try to research about this topic in America Latina, in Latin America, we have to change the approach. So we have to talk about local diversity, or what? Okay.
Well, here is where there might be another solution with the term hyperdiversity, because probably, I don't know anything about Mexico, but probably people coming from different parts of Mexico are quite, in a way, different from others. In their behavior, for example, in their attitudes. I give you an example from another country in our project, from Turkey. We have Istanbul as our case study. And also in Istanbul, there's relatively not so much international migration. But the migration to Istanbul is from the countryside and from different countrysides in Turkey. And sometimes you talk about countrysides that are literally close to Istanbul, sometimes very far away in another part of the country. Sometimes there is a religious difference, for example, Kurds coming from different parts of the country to Istanbul. So also in that country you have the difference between different groups coming to the city. And it's not international migration, but still there's a lot of difference between those groups. And when you put them together in an area, in a neighborhood, there might be some problems because they don't like each other's attitudes. They don't like each other's activities. And they, or maybe not a question of not liking, but they just do different things. They are interested in different things. Some people might be interested in a lot of contacts with their neighbors. And some people are not. They don't want to do anything with their neighbors and things like that. So I think here also the idea of hyperdiversity can be very important. I think the term superdiversity, as Vertovec labeled it, is very much focused on international migration. And I think the term hyperdiversity is much less focused on international migration. It also takes account of the fact that even people who have lived in the city for their whole life, or people who were born there and still live there, they might be very different from each other. So I think hyperdiversity will work in Mexico.
Work? Yeah. So, well, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your attendance. And I think that we close the ISDUB seminars this year. So I think that this was a good ending. Thank you. I think that the list of your question marks will be in our minds for a long while, because I mean, there are some issues that could be developed in many research projects. So this is what we are trying to develop here. So thank you, Ronald. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.